Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to be with you today and introduce you to the next guest on Scala's Love of Learning series, where we talk about exemplary educators. And I'm delighted to have with us today Andrew Hansen. Andrew currently works at Anselm House at the University of Minneapolis in St. Paul. And I'm having him here today to have a discussion with us about Anselm House, its programs and its activities, and its mission to serve as a place of integrating knowledge and faith formation. And one of my enduring questions in Scala, whose mission is to promote classical liberal arts education with an understanding of the person as created in the image of God, I'm always trying to find educators who are doing this model of the university where all fields of knowledge are related to each other and related to one's own vocation, and looking at how does one educate in light of that mission in a whole variety of different contexts. The United States is blessed with a diverse system of higher education, with public research universities, secular liberal arts colleges, Christian liberal arts colleges. And I think that this mission of educating the whole person cuts across those different institutional types, but at the same time has to take on particular characteristics relative to its context. So I invited Andrew to have this conversation with me as an ongoing part of the classes I teach through Scala and at Princeton Theological Seminary, where I'm keenly interested in the intersection of Christianity and the liberal arts tradition and how this understanding of truth can spread to different places. So Andrew, thank you so much for agreeing to be here with me today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a delight to be here.
I wondered if you wouldn't mind, just as a way of intro, before we get into the specifics about Anselm House at the University of Minnesota, could you tell us just a brief history of the Christian Studies Center movement as a movement and how that relates to changes in higher education over the last 50 years, in particular the place of faith communities in secular institutes of higher education?
For sure. I'd be glad to give a quick overview, and I should preface it by saying that I am a historian by training, and I've done a lot of work in the history of higher education. So I have some expertise in the history of higher ed and American higher ed, but not study centers in particular. There's a recent book that has come out by a scholar named Charles Cotherman that looks at the history and origins of the study center movement, which is really the best resource that's out there. It's called To Think Christianly. It just came out last year. So a lot of what I might say is coming out of that book. As I see it, there's two really broad streams that give rise to what today are Christian study centers on secular college campuses. And I take those streams, one to be coming out of Protestant evangelicalism, and the other one to be coming out of the Catholic tradition. And Cotherman's book focuses exclusively on the Protestant evangelical tradition and the institutions that become the Consortium of Christian Study Centers. And there's other explicitly Catholic institutions that I think don't share that lineage, and I don't know as much about that lineage. So maybe that's part of the conversation that we could have today, because I'm wondering, Margarita, if you might know more about that history than I do. But in any case, I think, so with that Protestant evangelical lineage, at least, the important thing to keep in mind is that it's all sort of a response to the secularization of higher education. So just some very broad brush history, in the 19th century, for the majority of the 19th century, most institutions of higher education were, confessional Protestant institutions. And that began to change toward the end of the 19th century. There was sort of a move to deconfessionalize and sort of make de-sectarian these kind of these educational institutions. And in the early 20th century, of course, there was some ruptures within different Protestant denominations over theological issues, and a lot of the theological conservatives pulled out of mainstream Protestant institutions and founded separate institutions. So fundamentalism, Protestant fundamentalism of the early 20th century. And the study center movement really comes in the middle of the 20th century. And this is the story that Cotherman tells really well in this book, with the rise of evangelicalism in the mid 20th century and kind of the shift from fundamentalism into evangelicalism, a kind of effort to re-engage with broader mainstream culture with Protestant evangelicals. And Cotherman really traces the origins of these Protestant evangelical study centers to two main institutions. And the first one is L'Abri, which was founded by Francis and Edith Schaeffer in the 1950s. So kind of like right when this transition from fundamentalism to evangelicalism is occurring. And Schaeffer was part of a fundamentalist Presbyterian church. He was a missionary to Europe, and he and Edith founded in the mid 1950s in Switzerland the ministry called L'Abri, and it was basically a retreat center, and still exists today. It's a retreat center that was meant to be. L'Abri means shelter in French, and it's meant to be a place of refuge and retreat for people wrestling with spiritual questions, wrestling with intellectual questions. And I think it was born out, especially of Francis Schaeffer's own kind of biography, and when he was in Europe, sort of engaging European culture, engaging modern thought, and realizing that he's coming out of a tradition that had not really wrestled with how does the Christian faith understand and relate to all of these modern intellectual questions and trajectories. And so he wanted to create a space in which young people could come and do that. And so he and Edith created this place of hospitality. And Francis was, very much interested in the intellectual questions. Edith, by all accounts, was an amazing person of hospitality and made it a physical space that welcomed a wide variety of people into the community. And so from the mid 1950s, again, it still exists today, but it's kind of the heyday of it is through the 1970s. It's a destination for a lot of predominantly Christian, but also some skeptics or questioning people as well to retreat, to explore this intersection of faith with intellectual life. And it was really person-centered. It was very kind of small community oriented. So it's a mixture of community life together, eating meals together, praying together, and then time for study and exploration. And so that was sort of the first, and as these study centers emerge, almost all of the leaders of the study centers draw some kind of inspiration from Francis and Edith Schaeffer. So really a kind of a foundational figure within this movement, but still very separated from, I would say, mainstream academia and culture. So not attached to a university. Francis himself was not sort of well integrated within mainstream academic institutions, but nonetheless very influential within evangelicalism for this sort of intellectual re-engagement of evangelicals. The second stream that Cotherman, or the second institution that Cotherman points to, is Regent College in Vancouver, the University of British Columbia. And Regent was founded, I believe, in the mid 1960s by Plymouth Brethren, and it was the idea for it, I think, came from laity within the Brethren Church who wanted to see more lay theological education. So they were convinced that for the church to remain vibrant, it needed a laity that was theologically educated and able to draw the connections between the Christian faith to all different areas of life and vocation. So it needed not just clergy that could make those connections, but also lay Christians that were able to do that. And so they founded essentially a lay theological seminary adjacent to the University of British Columbia. Again, drawing inspiration in some ways from Francis Schaeffer and L'Abri. James Houston, the first, I believe, principal of Regent, had been a professor at Oxford, so it was also heavily influenced by that Oxford model of small collegiate education of tutors and students in discussion together. And so also maintain that very person-centered focus on education, that you can't sort of abstract education from the lived context of being in community together, sharing meals together, sharing life together. But Regent was much more integrated into mainstream academic culture. They achieved a academic standing within adjacent to the University of British Columbia. And so you have sort of the emergence of a Christian theological institution right next to a major secular research university in Canada. And so those are what Cotherman would point to as kind of the roots of these study centers. And then what you see in the 70s onward is just a spread of that impulse to found these kind of institutions to the United States. So you see many people that are drawing from these traditions, again, mostly Protestant evangelicals, but wanting to replicate that regent model in the United States. And so one of the first ones that gets founded is the one that Morgan referred to at the University of Virginia in the 1970s, the Center for Christian Study at the University of Virginia. And very much taking Regent College as the model that they're trying to replicate at a US university. So that's sort of the deep history of the movement, kind of how it's responding to trends in higher education. The Consortium of Christian Study Centers got founded in 2009, I believe. And that has brought together a lot of these institutions for learning, kind of exchange of best practices. And today there's about 33 member institutions and then a number of partnering institutions as well, which Scala Foundation is, I believe, one of the partnering institutions as well.
Yes, we are. Thank you. Thank you for that. I will just say by way of, dialogue or rounding out the picture, because you mentioned the existence of Catholic study centers. Mm-hmm. I am not trained in history, but through my work with Scala and my interest in higher education, I have been a part of a number of panels on the history of Catholic education in the United States. And I do think it's worth highlighting perhaps a little bit of a difference of the emergence of the contemporary Catholic kind of study centers that point at similar questions what the Christian study centers are trying to do, but perhaps got there through a different path. Mm-hmm. In some ways, what happened in the United States was that Catholic education was primarily for Catholics initially. In the public school system, we're talking the 1800s and the 1900s. There was a massive influx of the teaching orders from Europe that set up parochial schools to educate Catholic children as Catholics. It was a kind of integral vision of faith, learning, life, etc. Polish language schools, schools with Irish Catholics, all the major immigrant groups, German Catholics, etc. St. Benedict's Abbey in Newark was founded by German monks serving the people of Newark in education, right? So there were tons of these. And at the same time, there was a lot of liberal arts colleges that were Catholic. Many of them were actually run by Catholic nuns. So Emmanuel College or Manhattan College that grew out of the sort of Catholic integration of faith and learning as kind of an important part of Catholic assimilation and really upward mobility in the United States. Then what happened around the 1960s, of course, with Vatican II, there was an interest amongst Catholics to become more integrated into the culture. And so Catholic universities wanted to transition from a liberal arts model to a research kind of model, right? That the Catholics should be using their minds and their skills to contribute to the frontiers of science. And so the mission of Catholic universities expanded beyond preserving the Catholic tradition and Catholic moral formation to the frontiers of knowledge, right? Embracing this forward-looking, research-oriented model. So now fast forward to around 30, 40 years later, when I come on the picture and I'm getting educated first at Yale and then at Princeton University, what I encountered at Yale University and Princeton University were essentially Catholic chaplaincies that did a lot of the work of what you're describing as of the Christian study centers, trying to integrate faith with learning, with spirituality. But I do think one of the differences is, and I've taught a little bit about this, some people like Mark Knoll, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, or George Marsden, his history of the university, but also his history of Protestant evangelicalism or fundamentalism. Catholics weren't ever pushing back against a rejection of the life of the mind. And my sense is that within the Consortium of Christian Study Centers and within the evangelical movement, as you've alluded to, the Christian Study Centers were trying to respond to a kind of a rejection of the life of the mind as potentially dangerous or leading you away from God. Whereas the rise of Catholic chaplaincies and Catholic study centers, it was almost more like maybe we've gone too far in embracing the culture and we need to turn back a little bit to embracing the spirituality of Catholicism and integrating that into the life of the mind. That Catholics got really good at the life of the mind, but we might have left behind the Catholic moral tradition or the Catholic faith formation or the Catholic spirituality. So I think, those are broad strokes, but I do think the contrast says something. And so now what's happening, and this is where I want our conversation to go about Anselm House, which, by the way, he was a Benedictine, a Catholic, embraced the life of the mind, whereas the Benedictines are actually known for their manual labor. That's why I'm pointing out that he was a man of letters, because not all Benedictines are people of letters. And by the way, my uncles went to St. Anselm's Abbey for school in Washington, D.C. when they came here from Cuba and didn't speak any English. So they got a Catholic education as they learned English. But now to sort of fast forward to, so just the presence of, whether they're Catholic or evangelical or whatever they are, the presence of these groups on campus that are reaching out to students, primarily of faith, but sometimes also in a kind of evangelizing way, and trying to show them the formation of their mind alongside their character formation and their spiritual formation. So I know you lead up a program like this at Anselm House. So could you briefly tell us about Anselm House, and then tell us about this 3-year curriculum that I understand that you have that tries to live this out?
For sure. So Anselm House emerged out of that Protestant evangelical tradition that I sketched out for you. It emerged as the McLaurin Institute was the name of it in 1982. So it was among the early of these Protestant Christian study centers, and it was founded by a staff member with InterVarsity, so some close kind of non-denominational Protestant evangelical ties, but founded with that vision of engaging the Christian faith with the life and work of the university. So not just focusing on spiritual questions, but really engaging all of life and engaging the academic work of students and faculty at the university. And it took a number of forms over the number of decades after its founding, and I joined in 2013. So I've been there for about 8 years at Anselm House, and I will say that despite emerging from a Protestant evangelical milieu, it has always aspired to be an ecumenical institution. And part of the rebranding and the name change to Anselm House, which was in 2015, was an effort to declare that this is a community of the Christian tradition, broadly speaking, for the university. So welcoming, Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox into this conversation together. But our mission is to connect faith and knowledge with all of life. So again, to not just focus on sort of the personal aspects of faith, the spiritual practices, although not ignoring those pieces too, but to say, how does the faith work itself out into every area of life that's represented at the university? So we want to be working with students and faculty at the university to explore what difference their faith would make for engineering, for biomedical ethics, for humanities. And really the students and faculty that are part of the community at Anselm House come from all over the university and all over from many different academic backgrounds. We're also a place that has, a lot of our events are open to the public, and so there is sort of a traffic between the university and the church community, and that has long been a part of McLaurin and then Anselm House's mission as well. But the Fellows program in particular that you mentioned, Margarita, started up when I came in 2013, and it was an effort to bring Christian education and a sort of Christian liberal arts and Christian theological education to full-time students at the University of Minnesota. So part of my own background was I grew up in a Christian household. I attended a public university and had a great experience, the University of Nebraska. I majored in history and philosophy. I found wonderful resources in a public institution, despite having initially I wanted to go to a private Christian school and get a sort of small residential college experience. And economically, it just didn't make sense for me to do so. So I ended up going to Nebraska and then had a wonderful time there and felt like I had a great I found communities that supported my faith, and I felt like I found a great academic community. I was part of the honors college at the University of Nebraska, lived in the honors residential college, but really had to work pretty hard to sort of carve out a good education within a state institution. Didn't have a lot of people guiding me, and had very few people guiding me in terms of that, integrating my faith with that conversation of learning. And so in some ways, the fellows program at Anselm House is to try to say, do students need to make that choice between either sort of a smaller Christian college experience that will be asking the questions of how all of this learning relates to their faith, or say the really excellent and outstanding resources available at a large research university? Is there a way that we can sort of provide both of those to students? And I think to some extent, the study centers have always been trying to do that project of how do we bring that into the context of a secular and public university. The fellows program was an effort to do that a little bit more systematically with a curriculum. So we started out with just a one-year program for fellows, and they're both graduate students and undergraduate students, and it's always been about a 50-50 mix, which is something pretty unique among campus ministries. There's not a lot of campus ministries that seem to bring graduate students and undergraduate students, let alone faculty, together. But from the beginning, it's been a community that's had both undergrad and grad students. But it developed into a 3-year program, or up to 3 years. So students commit to a year, but they can stay for up to 3. And our effort with the program is to give them sort of a broad theological framework for making sense of what it is that they're doing at the university and what it is that they're going to go out into the world to do. So really the question of vocation, what am I called to, is at the heart of the program. And when I was kind of thinking about curriculum, I think one of the big challenges with this work is that students aren't getting any credit for doing it, and they're taking full course loads. And so you really have to be disciplined with your expectations. Like, students just don't have a lot of time in addition to their classes. So what are the few things that we're able to do with students in this context? And that's one of the reasons why we grew from a 1-year to a 3-year program, is we realized we need more time. This needs to span several years so that we can continue these conversations. But the question was sort of like, with the limited time, what could we give to students? And influential for me was the work of philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, his work After Virtue, in which he talks about the importance of story and the importance of narrative in self-understanding and in moral formation in general, saying that morality is closely linked to sense of purpose, and we have to have a sense of what story we're a part of and where we're going and what sort of actor we are in the world in order to answer the question of how do I live well in the world. And so we were trying to develop a curriculum that helps give students a broadly Christian story, a Christian account of the world that can orient their work at the university, that can orient their sense of vocation as they go out into the world. So we've developed that into 3 years. The first year we call The Good Story, and it's just trying to give students a sense of that story at the broadest level. So it basically walks through the Christian story as it comes to us in Scripture, from creation to new creation. So they're reading large chunks of the Bible together. They're looking at the historic Christian creeds to say, what are the broad outlines of the Christian account of the world, and where do we as humans come into that story that God is writing of the world. The second year then gets a bit more specific. So these years kind of move from broadest to most focused and most narrow. And the second year we're calling The Good Life. And it's really asking, what is a human life well lived within the Christian tradition? And that one we've reorganized this year to really focus on the virtue tradition within Christian ethics, which again fits well with this emphasis on story. Obviously, MacIntyre is well known within the Christian virtue tradition, but really trying to give students a sense for how has the Christian tradition over the years answered this question of what does it mean to live life well within God's story. And then the third year is the most specific year yet, and it's really getting to that question, like applying these questions for students in their work at the university. And we call that year the common good, and it's thinking about what does Christian faithfulness mean for me in this moment in time and in space. So saying, we've sketched these broad outlines of the Christian story of a life well lived, but that has to take a particular shape for you in this moment and in this place. So we start out the year looking at just basically trying to understand the present moment in 21st century America, where these students find themselves. Why does the university look the way that it does today? Why, what are the particular challenges for Christians, both within the university and within broader culture today? And then how do we then begin to discern what faithfulness means for us in particular? And so in the spring semester, students really get into thinking about that in relationship to their field. And we ask them to do portfolios that we call faith and knowledge portfolios, where they're saying, what are the questions that seem most important to you as a Christian within your field of study, or whatever it is that you sense you're being called into after you leave the university? And they find resources within the Christian tradition to help address those questions. They develop a personal statement around those questions that they present to the group. And it's basically just a semester of workshops trying to apply what they've been learning for these 3 years very specifically to their own work in the university. So that's the curriculum, a sketch of it, Margarita.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating, Andrew. So let me just repeat, I think, what I heard, and I have a few questions for you. It sounds like the introductory level, as you said, it was the story. And so you start with broad strokes of the Christian story about creation and new creation, sort of God's action in us, it sounded like. And then the second year, focusing more on the good life without using the word virtue in the title, but sort of essentially talking about the virtues tradition. And that seemed to me to be the place where you most directly address something like character formation or virtue. And then in the third year, focusing more on vocational discernment. And as students advance in this curriculum and they're considering next steps for their study or for their work, it's almost like you're launching them into the rest of their life with this little mission statement, and I was just thinking, gosh, I wish I had a program like that. I mean, I sort of did pieces of that, but I did a mission statement at my, a 7 Habits of Highly Effective People seminar when I was in graduate school, not focusing on faith per se, but certainly focusing on purpose and meaning. So one question that I have for you in doing this, and this is an enduring question of the seminars that I teach on this, there's a lot of appeal to this kind of intentional community life of integrating faith and knowledge. But as we mentioned earlier, you're doing this specifically at a secular university and in a very pluralistic context. So how do you form students in that context to continue to have their community around the study center at St. Anselm's House, while also being able to fruitfully engage with people of different faith backgrounds or no faith background, and it seems to me not have a conflictive attitude or even necessarily an attitude of superiority, because the idea of the secular university is that everybody is there on equal terms. So how do you do this? How do you provide them with a vocabulary or a sense of mission that is hospitable to people who are different than them?
Yeah, that's great. The first thing to say is that I think this is maybe one of the great advantages or promises of a Christian study center as an institution of Christian education vis-a-vis, say, a Christian college, is that students are immersed in the university setting day to day, and so they're having to do that engagement with people that disagree with them in all of their classes and all of life. So really what we're doing is spending a couple of hours in, intentional Christian formation, in addition to the vast majority of their time, which is spent in a pluralistic setting. So they're learning to navigate the pluralistic reality that we live in a way that if you pull them out for 4 years and put them into, more of a situation in which they're with people that agree with them, then sometimes they're sort of launched out into the reality of pluralism and haven't learned to navigate that. So I think some of it is just living within the university context. The other thing I would say is that that sort of pluralistic engagement is very much a part of the Anselm House mission. So sometimes I think about our mission with sort of two tracks or two prongs. The first one is Christian formation, so working with Christians that are in the university, working with faculty, working with students to draw these connections between their faith and what they're doing. But then there's a second piece of our mission, which I think of the engagement of the Christian faith with the work of the institution of the university. And so this is coming together with people of all faiths, no faiths, to say, what are the big questions that we need to be addressing, and how, for us as Christians, how do the intellectual resources of the Christian faith, what do they contribute to that conversation? So how can we work together with others in the university to address some of these enduring and big questions? And so I'd say that one of the major ways this happens, again, the Fellows program is much more on that Christian formation side, but a lot of our events and things are, co-sponsored with academic departments. We'll feature, faculty from the university that are not Christians. And so a lot of what we're doing is modeling what that would look like for students in the university. So I can think of one event that we did, which was excellent, where we had a couple of faculty from biomedical engineering, one that's a Christian, one that is agnostic, just come and talk with students about what their friendship has looked like in the university context. So, they've gotten to know each other in the context of a secular university. They didn't have a lot of opportunities to talk about faith together, but once they sort of realized that they were both interested in big questions, they developed an intellectual friendship that allowed them to talk about these things. And so they just talked with students about, what does that look like? How have you engaged well as people that disagree on fundamental questions, but as colleagues within a secular institution? How have you made space for that? And so I think just seeing examples of that through the community of Anselm House is probably the most important piece of that for students. The Common Good Year really talks a lot about that challenge of pluralism, because it's just a totally different context than, say, medieval Christianity in terms of how Christians live out their faith today. So we're sort of thinking very explicitly about, what does faithfulness mean in a pluralistic environment, and in an environment where, Christians are the minority culture. So in some ways, returning to what Christianity was when it first emerged.
Wow, that's really interesting. So on the note, first of all, you said, I think, an important word. You tried to host events at Anselm House. So you described for us a piece of Anselm House, which is this kind of cornerstone 3-year curriculum.
Yeah.
But there are other activities, and it seems like you said you model. So you invite members of the faculty to have conversations with students where they talk about how do they think about their faith in pluralistic context. And maybe some of them aren't necessarily people of Christian faith or evangelical faith, but people to speak to this general question about how they operate in a pluralistic context. Did I get that right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's what I observed when I was at Yale. I believe Rivendell Institute is a member of the Christian Studies Center. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And they host a lot of, they host Bible studies, and they host very, events for people who are very committed to the Christian faith, but they also host open dialogues with people of different faiths. And they are part of a group of organizations that host faculty roundtables, and they will intentionally have a person of faith and a person of no particular faith or of a different faith dialoguing on the same question. Because I think what you said right now about modeling what this kind of pluralistic dialogue looks like from professors, I think students really like to see that and to hear that, because it's one thing to cover it in the curriculum, which it sounds like you do, but it's another thing to kind of to see it, because we learn by engaging in things as well as by reflecting on it.
Yeah.
And also, as you said, there's no shortage of kind of Christian reflection on what it means to be a faithful Christian when you're a minority in your environment. So I think that that's really important, because the goal doesn't seem to be to form people only to survive within a particular kind of community where people all share their background and their beliefs, because that's simply not the environment most of them are going to go into. And maybe that's not even what Christ is calling us to do. So to avoid some of the closedness that can happen with this. So along those lines, I kind of, what is the relationship between Christian study centers and actual schools of theology or, departments of theology? I mean, I think the other Christian study center that I visited was at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And so the United States, again, is blessed with this rich diversity of schools, whereas the Ivy Leagues actually were initially founded as schools of ministry, and then they grew into liberal arts colleges, research universities, and mostly dropped their affiliation with a religious denomination, which you described. But state universities mostly were not founded to train ministers. They were founded to train citizens, to train people, lay people. So the University of North Carolina, for example, never had a school of theology. And what you end up with then is, the campus is 25% Catholic, and a lot of them are Christian, but they're at a public university, which doesn't have a school of theology. So I guess my question is, this is more of the case with you more, the University of Minnesota, is there actually an official school of theology anywhere at the University of Minnesota? And has there ever been?
There isn't and there hasn't, and you're exactly right. A lot of these private institutions that came out of schools for ministers still have divinity schools. So Duke, for instance, Harvard has a divinity school, Chicago. But you're right, the public research institutions mostly don't, but a lot of them do have. In fact, I can't think off the top of my head of any. Can you, Margarita, that have a school of theology? Public?
I don't know for sure, so I don't want to misspeak, but most of the divinity schools are with universities that were founded as Christian institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's worth noting, John Henry Newman in his book, The Idea of a University, really argues for theology as a branch of knowledge. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, theology has only been considered a branch of knowledge in universities that are Christian or once were Christian. And theology became a specialized field, which is part of what Newman was trying to push back on, that it shouldn't be. But then the question then becomes at a public secular university, and this used to come up at the University of North Carolina, we can't have a theology department because we can't teach a confessional point of view.
Right.
We can't promote a single point of view. And so I think when I talk with administrators here at Princeton University or North Carolina, what has ended up happening is that they've created a diverse, pluralistic environment with a lot of religious backgrounds, but there's actually not a space to discuss those beliefs. So they end up becoming privatized in a way. And I mean, and students say this to me here at Princeton University, you might have a Muslim friend or a Buddhist friend, but nobody's talking about that. And it's interesting to me that my roommate at Yale that I lived with for 3 years, she was Jewish, and she did her Jewish thing on Friday night, and I did, Friday and Saturday, and I did my Catholic thing on the weekends, and we had a great time living together. And we never talked about our faith. Now we do, 25 years later. But it was kind of almost like this, well, that's your thing and I have my thing, And I had one secular Jewish student in an undergraduate class that I taught. And she said, this was here at Princeton University. She said, I came here so interested to learn about religious diversity. And my Muslim friend, my Catholic friend, and my Hindu friend, as soon as they get to Princeton, they stop actually practicing their religion. So they have nothing to tell me. And so my point was, I think the reality of people being diverse and actually engaging around that diversity they're different things. And sometimes having a center that's called the Jewish Center or the Christian Center or the Catholic Center, people of other faiths can walk in there and know that, okay, I'm going to encounter somebody who's going to tell me the Christian story now. And I do think, although there's a risk of imposing one's view, I also think there's a genuine curiosity. Like, what is the Muslim story? And what is the Buddhist story? What is the Jewish story? Where can I go learn that?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I mean, I think that's a common refrain that I hear all the time at the university is faculty, that will have served in the same department for 10 years or more, but they had no idea that their colleagues had a faith life because there's just it doesn't come up. There's no space for it within the university. And back to your original question about the relationship to theology within the university. So Minnesota does not have a school of theology, but it does have religious studies. So the difference being, as you said, not a confessional approach to religion, but a descriptive I mean, from my understanding, sort of the origin of religious studies, an attempt to sort of present a descriptive and objective account of religion rather than a sort of confessionally motivated one. So, have really wonderful relationships with faculty that teach in religious studies, encourage our students to take classes in the history of Christianity, history of religion, things like that. But you're right that a space for sort of theologically motivated reflection within the university doesn't exist. And so one of the things that I think Anselm House brings is the creation of that space for Christian faculty, but for faculty of all faiths and no faiths too. So one of the things that we've heard so we've been doing some of these faculty roundtables as well within the university, and they've been really well received because, first of all, it's a beautiful expression of hospitality to the university to say, come enjoy a meal with your colleagues. We know that there's not a lot of opportunity to get to know one another at that sort of very relational level of sharing a meal. So just that alone, I think, is important. But then a lot of faculty have said there's just no space within either my department or the university as a whole to talk about these really big questions that transcend disciplinary boundaries and transcend the sort of technical questions that the university spends so much of its time on. And I got into academia because I wanted to talk about like big, meaningful things. And so, even though I don't share your views, thank you for making space for me to talk to other people about those things. And I think that's a beautiful gift that Christian Study Centers can offer.
Yeah, I recently participated in a webinar, faculty roundtable at Yale, with an ornithologist. I think his name is Richard, I want to say Crum, and a Japanese American Christian painter named Makoto Fujimura, and they were talking about beauty in nature. And I thought it was great. And Crum identifies essentially as, I think, an agnostic or kind of undefined, but generally, as you say, a natural scientist really open to the big questions, but not himself confessionally grounded in any tradition, but very happy to engage with people who are. And I thought it was, as you said, modeling where Crum was willing to admit the boundaries of what he can say as a biologist who doesn't have a confessional position. And then Fujimura presenting his confession as a Christian and what that brings to him. So I thought it was done in an incredibly respectful and open-ended way. And by the way, I have a webinar coming up with Makoto Fujimura because I want to learn more about beauty and theology. And so that kind of spreading, learning about people, meeting people leads me to another question, which is, hey, it seems on the one hand that it's precisely the success of the Christian Studies Center model. And I know that nobody wants to impose a model. Each Christian Study Center is quite unique. I've been to some of your meetings. I visited a couple of the houses. You mentioned the one at University of Wisconsin is 16,000 square feet. I want to visit that place. That's like a small liberal arts college itself. Others, like I think it's Chesterton House at Cornell, have residences for 35 people. So every house has its own character. But it seems that although secular universities are not coming anywhere near founding a school of theology, they are open to confessional groups of a variety of kinds to founding Christian Studies Centers. So one, in theory, could have a Jewish study center. Those exist in plenty of places. One could, on a secular campus, have vibrant communities of faith using the space, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, I alluded to it in the paper, but to me, the really intriguing possibility is not so much a public or a secular space in which the religious questions are bracketed, but what does it look like to have a really robust pluralism of religious perspectives as part of the work of the university? And I do think, I agree with you that I think that's possible. I don't think we've seen it done well in the United States. My sense is that in some other countries, they've been more open to religious affiliated, institutions within the state universities. But in the United States, I think that's been pretty limited. One of the interesting developments that I've seen is, I believe it's at the University of Arizona, the University of Mary, a Catholic institution in North Dakota, has a satellite campus at Arizona, which the University of Arizona, I think, has recognized in official standing, and I think is accepting credit from the University of Mary as transfer credit within this institution. So there's a model of like integrating religious institutions within a state institution. There are a couple of other study centers that are doing similar kind of transfer credit approaches, but I'd love to see it be the case where the state universities were sort of capacious enough that we could have, a confessionally Buddhist, a confessionally Christian center within the university and not just sort of adjacent to it. So, right now, Anselm House is completely outside of the university, with the exception of our students forming a student group, an extracurricular group within the university. And I would love to see kind of a stronger connection between universities and study centers develop.
That's a really interesting model, because now that you say that, it does spark a memory that one of the initial sort of Catholic study centers, which you may have heard of, is called Lumen Christi. It's at the University of Chicago. And I know that when I was talking with their founder, Thomas Levergood, he did speak of a model that potentially an area of expansion of the Catholic Study Center model would be to work with secular universities of all kind, University of Illinois, Chicago, Illinois State, and see if they're open to a partnership where a diocese, a Catholic diocese or a Catholic college close to University of Illinois could partner so that undergraduate students could take classes in theology for credit, but have it count towards their state school degree, right? So, and I think he has found some success there, that state universities are already doing these kinds of partnerships. Well, we can't offer everything, so your degree is from here, but you can take a subset of classes from another institution because it's going to provide you a kind of training that we don't offer, but it counts towards your total credits to graduate here. And so I think he's trying to think, just like I was saying, the vast majority of Catholic students go to secular state schools for reasons that you described. Well, they're very good schools and they're not nearly as expensive, right? So University of Nebraska is a wonderful school. University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill is a wonderful school. And the price tag is much more manageable. You can live close to home. So this might be an area of actual theological. So then students would have a confessional theological degree, or even just a minor. But if they do it with Catholics or Protestant Christians, in theory, they could do it with any group that came forward with an accredited theological degree in, it could be Judaism, it could be a different religion. So I think there's some openness to think about creative ways of doing this. So kind of the last question, which is a big question, maybe a small question, is how does one start a Christian Study Center? And can they also occur perhaps at younger ages in high schools, in different, so that's kind of how does one get one started? And could it be in a high school setting that's private or a charter or a public?
That's a great question. I think that's been maybe one of the challenges of the study center movement is how do you get these things started and how do you support them? Because, as far as I'm aware, they're almost all entirely supported philanthropically with donations from private individuals or small family foundations. Very few have much of a tuition kind of revenue model, if any. And so a lot of it is a fundraising challenge of like getting a project, having the vision for a project and then getting it off the ground is very entrepreneurial. And so the study centers that have been successful often have, I think, had people with an entrepreneurial vision that can figure out how to meet those challenges and find support for the vision and mission. The Consortium of Christian Study Centers, founded in the early 2000s, has made steps in sort of bringing a lot of these study centers together to think about the kind of process of starting study centers and best practices. So if I were to meet somebody that wanted to start a study center, I would first refer them to the consortium because they can connect you with current directors, people that have been through the process before, to get coaching to figure out just the practical challenges of how do you do this. I would like to see that become even more streamlined. Like maybe the consortium could provide funding to help get new centers started, things like that. And then the question of high schools, I've had the same thought of, we have a similar kind of ecosystem of high school or elementary education where there's, private parochial schools, and then there's public institutions. And there are the analogs of campus ministry, Young Life, that are sort of present in high schools at least. There very well could be sort of a Christian study center in a high school as well, or adjacent to a high school, so that it wouldn't be do I choose Christian education or do I choose public education? But again, could I get both at the same time? And to date, I'm not aware of any projects that have done that. But I continue to think that that's really important, because I'm sure you've seen this as well, but it just feels like more and more we need more of this training earlier on. It feels like a lot of times what we're doing with students in terms of theological education feels like this should have been done much sooner within their faith communities. And they're sort of unprepared for the challenge of integrating it at the level of the university. And so I would love to see something analogous, start up within institutions of public secondary education.
Well, we can leave that as kind of an aspiration for 2021 and years to come. And I'm keenly interested in the K-12, in particular the high school level, because I do think that, as you describe, some of these big questions about the meaning of life and the intellectual thinking about virtues and habits really does kick in high school. Mm-hmm. And it can be, character and morality can be deformed or simply left to languish. And so I have been inspired by meeting people who have founded classical high schools, but I've also met lots of children, parents in public school settings or private school settings, but maybe not confessional private school settings, who are looking for this kind of integral formation. And so I just wonder, just leaving that out there as an aspiration, finding the high school teachers or principals who could participate in the study center movements or in Catholic institutes in higher ed, and then bring that back, or ways to have a high school program for students where they would experience being on campus at University of Minnesota or Nebraska or Princeton, and then pose some of these questions. I have a nephew who's applying for college, and I was, sharing with him some of what I was writing, and, he was really interested in it. And my niece, who's younger, I mean, she's asking deep moral, theological, philosophical questions. And it is striking to me that it's not in their curriculum, even though in theory they're taking religion classes. It's not quite, the theological, philosophical grounding. Some of it's there. But I think there's a way that higher ed can bridge to the high school space and unite this vision, which is really, the more that I do this, I talk about lifelong learning. I mean, the end of integrating faith and life and the end of character formation and moral formation. I mean, it truly is a lifelong process. And to think about it more and more developmentally and integrating people across the lifespan to get together would be great. So thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing your insight about Anselm House. It's amazing curriculum, the wonderful work that you're doing. I hope that anyone listening to this will visit your website, learn more about your work, and visit the website of the Consortium of Christian Study Centers, and of course, Scala Foundation's website, which will host this video and many others as an attempt to share with the kinds of dialogues that you and I are having, to try to bring those to people who might find some inspiration and try to start applying these ideas and, of course, adapting them to their own context. But with the conviction that human beings are made in the image of God, and we have a beautiful mind that is looking to be developed and formed in community with an ideal of service and gratitude to God for our gifts. So thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for joining us on Scala's Love of Learning, Exemplary Educators series, and I look forward to speaking more with you in the future.
Thanks so much, Margarita.
Bye now.
Bye.